Well, welcome to Lesson 6, the final lesson in our series on the study of the book of Job. As we get to the end of our study of the book of Job, I want us to kind of do a quick little review of kind of the book and what we've talked about as a whole. You know, when we come to the book of Job and you just kind of outline the book, it begins with a prologue and it ends with what they call an epilogue. You can kind of see this. I know it's really, really small. If you want me to, I can send you this as a file where you could look at it. But this is a more complicated version of the outline. But basically, the book of Job starts with chapters 1 and 2, and it introduces us to Job. It introduces us to God in the divine assembly, the challenger, the big problem of the book of Job. Does Job fear God for nothing? And then to the sequence of his sufferings, first to his family and possessions, and then to himself. And then we get Job's lament, where he's like, why was I ever even born? I cursed the day of my birth. And goes through that. And his friends listen to that. They're quiet. They don't say anything at all. And then they start to speak, and Job speaks. And it forms the big section of the book where the three friends have a dialogue with Job, where they're so convinced that he must have done something wrong. There's no other explanation in their mind for how Job could be suffering, especially so badly, unless he did something, really, really bad. And then the fourth friend, Elihu, comes in, and he has a different perspective. It looks at the subject from a little different perspective. Instead of focusing on the idea that he just must have done something wrong, Elihu also critiques Job for his sense of his own self-righteousness and how dare he claim such innocence. But then God shows up, and when God shows up, he tells Job, were you there when I formed the foundations of the world? Can you really understand the way I run the big, big world? The way you and your friends have kind of simplified me and the way the world works. You don't really grasp who I am. You think that I'm some kind of mechanical, operational, that I have some simple little policy that's how I run the world. But I'm actually a God who is infinitely wise, beyond your ability to understand, and the way I run the world is not the way that you as a human being could begin to even possibly understand. And then Job, at the end of the book, repents and says, I'm sorry, acknowledges what he did was wrong in terms of questioning God, questioning God's justice. And then God rewards him. He ends up being better off than he was at the beginning of the story. And so that is kind of the whole of the book of Job. Now, what we've done in this series is rather than just focusing on that, we have looked at kind of the heart of the book. The question of, do we worship God or the goods that he gives us, is the big theme of the book of Job. And we just have walked through it, starting with, why should we even study it? And I told you as we studied it that it doesn't say all the things people think that it does. It isn't a book about Job. It isn't a book about suffering. It's actually a book about God, and God is and his policies are being critiqued as to whether or not they're the right way to run the world. And we see that when the Satan, the challenger, challenges God in the divine assembly. In lesson 2, I explained to you that the Hebrew, the original language of the Hebrew, says the Satan, not Satan. It's not a personal name and referring to the diabolical figure we meet in the New Testament, but rather it is to a message as a divine member, a member of the divine council who is challenging God's policies and programs, and it doesn't match the picture that we get in the rest of the New Testament, for example, about the devil as the prince of demons and the arch enemy of God. But rather, this seems to be in Job, someone who is a member of God's court and is challenging God's policies. And then we just looked really hard at the question of, is God in the dock? And the answer, of course, is God is in the dock. God is on trial in the book of Job in the way that he runs the world. And we looked at the way that question is teased out in the book and the significance of it. I explained the triangle where the three different positions exist. Is God just? Is Job righteous? Or is the retribution principle true? The principle that says if you do something bad, or if you do something wrong, something bad is going to happen to you. If you do something good's going to happen to you. And they inferred from that because Job was suffering, he must have done something bad. And the truth is that's not how God runs the universe. And we talked about that. Then I talked about, does Job have friends in low places? I talked about the kind of friends that Job actually had. At first, they were really good friends, and then they weren't good friends. They assumed he must have done something wrong. They weren't comforting. They weren't helpful. They even doubled down and said things like, hey, Job, your kids, they were clearly so bad. That's why this is what's happened to them. And Job, you know what? You're actually kind of getting off easy. You deserve worse than what you're getting. I mean, hardly good friends. At one point, Job just finally says, you guys are miserable comforters. And then we come to the end of the book where God shows up and he starts to talk about two big creatures, Behemoth and Leviathan. And Leviathan in particular is an image, is a very famous image in the ancient world of a sea creature, a dragon, a chaos creature. We talked about how in Genesis God created kind of the monsters of the deep. And the reason this comes up in the book of Job is because nobody can tame this super powerful beast. And so one of the things God is saying to Job is, hey, you're trying to tame me. You can't tame that creature. You can't. How could you tame me? But I can tame that creature. I created it and I can tame it. And the message there is we shouldn't try to tame God. But then we come to the end, and this is where we are today, with a more personal question out of the book of Job, which is the question of, where is God when it hurts? Now, I've told you that the big question of Job is, do we worship God with the goods that he gives us? Does Job fear God for nothing? Job 1:9. Well, another way to think about this is, and we've said this throughout the series, is to say that the real question of the book of Job is this: what do I think about God when I suffer? When life gives you the worst possible outcome, how am I going to think about God? If tomorrow my world is upside down and everything seems not the way that it should be, is it going to change my understanding and my perspective, my view of God? Now, the way we ask this question when we suffer in life is, where is God when it hurts? Clive Staple Lewis, C.S. Lewis or Jack Lewis, very famous Christian author, was an atheist and became a Christian and became one of the most famous Christians ever. Went through enormous suffering, both in his childhood and in his adulthood, with the loss of his mother in his childhood. Went through the World War I, lost his wife to a bitter bout with cancer, and he wrote quite a bit about pain. He wrote a little book called The Problem of Pain. He wrote other books like Grief Observed and so on. But in Problem with Pain, C.S. Lewis made this comment. He said that pain insists on being attended to. You know, when we think about pain, that's one of the things about it. I mean, whenever you have like a really sharp pain, you step on something, it's sharp, it just gets you, a wasp stings you, you slam your finger in the door. Nobody says, oh, well, I'm not going to worry about that. I'll just ignore that and go on about it. No, it demands our attention. Pain insists on being attended to. And then he says this: God whispers to us in our pleasure, right? Something good's happening to us in life. We often don't even think about God. You know, we might go, oh, thanks God for this good thing that's happening. He says he speaks to us in our consciences, but he shouts to us in our pains. And then he makes this statement: it is his megaphone to rouse a deaf world. Lewis's view is that suffering, whatever God's purpose is in suffering, one of the benefits of suffering is it reminds us of our need for God, of his existence. And one of the things that we ought to think about as we finish this today is we ought to think about, when we ask the question, where is God when it hurts? It could very well be that when we are suffering, God is actually communicating to us in a very loud and powerful way. Now, as Job suffers throughout his experience, and his friends come to him and they say, hey, Job, you must have done something wrong, and that's why you're suffering. It turns out they were wrong, and God vindicates Job. In Job 42, verse 7, the Lord roars to one of Job's friends, Eliphaz, my wrath is kindled against you and your two friends. Here God speaking to the friends. This is at the end of the book. And he's saying to these guys, you got it all wrong. My wrath is kindled against you and your two friends. For you have not spoken of me or to me what is right, as my servant Job has. In other words, what we find out at the end of the book is Job's friends are totally wrong. Job actually was right. And when we think about the question of where is God when it hurts, the danger is that we actually think about our suffering or think about God in our suffering the way the friends do. Now think about, how do the friends think about God in relationship to suffering? Well, they just assume that if you're suffering, you must have done something bad. So you might describe it like this. They imagine God, in answer to the question of where's God when it hurts, by saying, God is sitting in the judgment seat. God is the judge, and God is pointing his finger at you and going, you did this wrong, you did this wrong, and you did this wrong. So anytime you suffer, it must be that you deserve it. You know, there's an author years ago wrote a book called God in the Box, and he talked about one of the problems that people do is they tame God by putting him in a box, and they imagine him as like a cosmic cop who's running around the universe, putting on his sirens, blowing his whistle, saying, look at you, you did this wrong thing. Or we think of God as maybe like a punisher. Job's friends certainly thought of him that way. And it's all built around this misunderstanding, as we've said throughout this series, of this concept known as a retribution principle. Generally, the retribution principle is true in the Bible, particularly in the part of the Bible we call the wisdom literature, which Job is a part of that. And it's the philosophy that says the righteous prosper and the wicked will suffer. Generally, that's true. Go read the book of Proverbs. And generally, in life, you will see that people who live a good and godly and righteous life prosper. In general, that's actually true. And that people who are wicked and criminal and bad and evil and all that kind of stuff, they suffer both internally and then eventually externally in their lives. The problem is when that principle, which is general, is then applied specifically in a person's life like this, which says if you see someone prospering, they must be righteous, or if you see someone suffering, they must have done something really bad. They must be really, really wicked. And so when we think of God like this, we put him we imagine God in the judgment seat pointing out the things that we have done wrong. We are doing what God said we're not supposed to do, which is we're trying to tame him like Leviathan in the book. We're trying to put God in a little narrow box that we have for him. One of the things the book of Job wants us to do is it wants us to understand that God does not run the universe in the way that we automatically think. He doesn't operate on the basis of justice. He's not the judge in the judgment seat. He is wise and beyond our ability to understand the way he runs the world. We can't possibly understand the purpose for every kind of experience in our life, and we would be really foolish to assume that God is simply in the judgment seat. Now here's the other seat we imagine God in an empty seat, right? What I mean by that is that God isn't around. God isn't available. He's MIA. He's gone AWOL. There's a verse in the Old Testament where the prophet Elijah comments about the gods of Baal, and he says, because they're not responding when the pagan prophets are calling out to him, and he says, "Hey, where's your God? Is he asleep? Is he going to the bathroom? What's going on?" Well, for some people, when we suffer in life, and let's be honest, we suffer in God, we feel like God is far away from us. From the cross, Jesus said, my God, why have you forsaken me? Why are you so far from the words of my groaning?" When we suffer in life, we often feel like God is far away, that God is not present for us and with us as we go through things. It's kind of like what they say about Elvis. Elvis has left the building. And there's a feeling sometimes when we're in suffering, it's like, okay, God, you've left the building. Another image of this might be born out of what happened in the late 1700s, 1800s in the world. It was a period of time known as the Enlightenment. And during this period of time, a view of God became very dominant and predominant. It's known as classical deism. Deism is a belief in God, but a belief that God is removed from us, that he's made the world like a big giant clock, like a mechanism, and it's just running. and God is removed from the world, and it's just running and running and running. So God doesn't really do miracles or do anything like that. The world just operates on its own. God is hands off, and it's just so. When we ask the question of where is God when I'm suffering, it's like, well, he's up there somewhere, and maybe he's paying attention, maybe he's not, maybe he's just letting the world run the way the world runs. Well, when we think about that view of God, that leaves us feeling like God, he's not there, and he doesn't even care. And in fact, in the 2nd and 3rd century of church history, there became a view of God that was similar to this, but I think in some ways almost kind of worse than this, which is not just that God wasn't really involved, but it was the fact that God is not even capable of caring about our situation. It's the view of God that he is impassible. He's not capable of experiencing human emotion. He's not capable, for example, of suffering as we suffer. The Greeks had this view of God in the 2nd and 3rd century. It went something like this. They would say, well, God doesn't change, right? Okay, yeah, that's true. Well, if God were to experience suffering, then his mood would change, and therefore he changed. So it must be that he doesn't have any emotions, and they called him impassible. He's not capable of these emotions. Well, I don't believe that. I think the Bible contradicts that. I think the Bible clearly shows us that God does care, that God is there, that God is very real and very present. Jesus weeps at the tomb of Lazarus. We see in the Old Testament that God is compassionate, that he's moved by our prayers and by our actions and by our concerns. God is involved in our lives and in our world in a way that shows genuine concern, genuine love. And the truth is God's not removed from us. God is watching. And think about this in the book of Job. God was not uninvolved in Job's experience. God was anxiously watching and experiencing everything with Job. He was rooting for him in the midst of his sufferings to go through them because Job was God's star witness. He needed Job to be able to suffer in a way that he would still be faithful to God, so that the policies would be proven right, that people don't just worship God for the benefits, and that God is not just some kind of benefit mercenary. So some of this comes up to us in our lives when we're suffering, and we just feel like God is so far away from us. But the truth is, I remember Tom Wright, N.T. Wright, a very famous writer and thinker, said this. He said that heaven is not so much distant, it is dimensional. It's not so much that God's way up there in the sky so far away from us. He's actually right close to us. Even though we don't feel him or so on, he is very close to us. And so from the cross, Jesus quoted Psalm 22, the Psalm of David, about suffering. If you've read the Bible or you've heard the story, he says from the cross, Eli, Eli, lama sabachthani. Eli means my God, my God. El is the Hebrew word God. The I is the my God, my God. Why have you forsaken me? This is what Jesus actually says from the cross. Now, let's be honest. Was Jesus forsaken by the Father when he died on the cross? No, of course he wasn't. This was part of the purpose and the plan of God. But Jesus felt like God had left the building. He felt like God was not there and did not care. That's how we feel when we suffer. And he goes on to say, why are you so far from saving me, so far from the cries of my anguish? And Jesus says that from the cross, because that's human to feel that. When we're suffering, it doesn't feel like God is close. But one of the things the book of Job shows us is that God is very close, and God is very aware, and God very much cares about what we're going through and what we're dealing with as we go through and deal with it. The question, sometimes when we think about where is God when we suffer, I remember years ago, pastor I had when I was first started going to church in college, David Dykes, who's become a mentor and a dear friend of mine. I remember him saying in a sermon one time that a man came to him who was very angry at God, and because his child had died tragically. And in his anger and in his emotion and his frustration, he said to the pastor, he said, where was God when my son died? And the pastor immediately just said the truth. He said he was in the same place that he was when his son died. In other words, when we experience human emotion and we feel like God is so far removed from us, we got to remember that as Jesus was dying on the cross, his Father was watching his son die. And the pain and the suffering and the agony that he experienced was felt by the Father at a degree that is even greater than that which is felt by the Son. God has not abdicated his throne. He hasn't left the front seat, gone to the back seat, or taken the easy seat out. God is right here in the midst of what we're going through, what we're dealing with. But the other thing to realize in the book of Job, and I remember when I was in seminary, I don't remember a lot about the book of Job from my seminary days because we didn't study it very long, but I remember my seminary professor making this statement. He said, a lot of times when we are suffering in life, like Job, or not even as bad as Job, we might say to God, where are you in this suffering? Where are you in this? And he said what we need to do is we need to hear God saying back to us the same question, which is, where are you in all of this? In other words, where are we when we suffer? Sometimes bad things are happening in the world. We look up and we're like, God, why is there all this stuff happening in the world? And the question may not be, where is God? It may be, where are we? What are we supposed to be doing? How are we supposed to be responding? What actions are we supposed to be taking to alleviate what's happening? Maybe God is calling us from the sidelines to step in and to be a difference maker in the world around us. So I think when we think about where is God when it hurts, one of the things we do, and we learn this from Job, is and his friends, God is in his judgment seat. Or else, and Job says this a lot in the book, God feels real far away. He's like, I want you to come down here. I want to talk to you face to face. It feels like he is like Elvis. He's left the building and the seat is empty. But I want you to see that there's another seat. I call this one the Santa seat. And what I mean by it is literally this picture, you know. When we think about Santa Claus, what do you think about? Man, Santa's great. What does Santa do? Well, Christmas rolls around and you get some presents, you know. Maybe if you're nice and not naughty, you know, you're going to get some good things and it's going to work out for you. Well, that actually is an idea in the book of Job. It is the very idea that the book of Job is getting across. And it's the criticism that the Satan, the challenger, has of God, that he runs the universe like a Santa Claus. If you're naughty, you don't get a present. You're on the naughty list. If you're nice, you're going to get something good. So this becomes a kind of grandfatherly picture of God. He becomes the Santa, the jolly old elf who gives nice gifts. Another way to see this Santa, God in the Santa seat, is to imagine God as like an ATM, right? What is God? Well, God is just, all right, I need some money. I'm going to pray and God's going to, dole out cash for me. Or God is like this, in case of emergency, break glass, right? God is the God of, a lot of people go through life and they're not worried about God. They're not talking about God. They're not thinking about God. Then something bad happens. And what do? Oh, I got to go to church. Oh, I got to start praying. Oh, God is my emergency plan. He's my 911 call center God. And who he is, he's just sitting up there in heaven and he is waiting to come to the rescue. This is a kind of silver bullet solution of God. That God is going to come in and he's the one-size-fits-all solution to all of our problems. But what ends up happening is we begin to get this view of God, which is that God becomes a mafia boss. This, of course, from the very famous movie about the mob. And the way the mafia works is they go around and they say, pay me for protection. We're going to protect you if you pay us. And that's what Job's friends want Job to do in the book. They want Job to appease God, and as if he was a benefit mercenary. And all they need to do is if they just keep giving him stuff, then they're going to get stuff, and it's transactional understanding of God and their situation. And all of these pictures of God are wrong. They're all inadequate. And the whole point of the book of Job is to tell us that. The book of Job was written to tell us those pictures of God, God in the judgment seat, God in an empty seat, or God is in the Santa seat, are the wrong views of God. God is not up there in heaven, and what we need to do is just pray, and our pain will be alleviated like a morphine pump in the ICU, and somehow our suffering will be eased. That view of God ends up taming him like Leviathan. It puts him in a little box. And it says that he runs the world on the basis of a simplistic principle, the retribution principle. But taming God is to see God as the silver bullet to all of our problems. It is to make God a benefit mercenary so that we can get our protection by getting our payoffs. And that means that the heart of this book really is about that question, that big question. Do we worship God, or do we worship the goods that he gives us? These kinds of goods, Santa goods, ATM goods, money, emergency, silver bullet solutions, paying him off so that we can get what it is that we supposedly need. All of these are wrong. God is not any of these things. And the book of Job was to help us to think about God differently when we're suffering. In fact, the truth of the matter is that the book of Job shows us that God is actually in not the judgment seat or the empty seat or Santa's seat. He is in the hot seat, and not any old hot seat. He's actually in your hot seat. Now, you know what it means to be in the hot seat. It means that you're in the situation where you've got to answer the questions and be responsible for what the outcomes of things and what's going on. But in the book of Job, Job's not on trial. God is on trial. And he's in the hot seat for how he runs the world. And what he does in Scripture is we see two ways in which God comes into not just his hot seat, but our hot seat. There are two big moments in the Bible where we see that. One is in creation. Remember what God did in the story of creation in the beginning? Adam and Eve. What did he put in the garden? A tree. And he said, you know what? Don't eat of it. But he gave them the freedom to do so. And because God created us with human freedom, you know what that means? It means we're not robots. That's a good thing. It means we can actually love God willingly. But you know what else it means? Is that we're capable of sin. And because God created us with free agency, with free will, that means that we are capable of sin, and we did sin. And so sin was introduced into the world in a powerful way that caused God suffering, his creation to suffer, our lives to experience suffering. But the other way that God is in the hot seat is the way that he steps into the story in terms of the cross of Jesus Christ. Now, I know in all of our minds, we always imagine we know what the cross of Jesus looked like because we've seen it, right? But when you go to Jerusalem, one of the things that they often tell you is that Jesus wasn't crucified on a hill called Calvary. That's actually a misunderstanding of the text. Calvary wasn't a hill. It was called a place of the skull. And most likely, Jesus was actually crucified just like the Romans crucified all those people along the highway that led into the city of Rome called the Appian Way. And it looked like this. This is when the Romans crucified so many people along the Appian Way. In other words, the cross of Jesus was a moment where Jesus entered into human suffering at eye level. People could walk up and see Jesus in his agony, in his humility, in his suffering. Crucifixion was the worst form of human capital punishment, as far as we know, that's ever been invented and utilized. The Romans perfected it. It was a long, torturous death that took often days and days and days, and a person would obviously be exposed to all the elements, unbelievable amounts of human pain and agony, and then would die through suffocation. Jesus died this way. He died through crucifixion. And so when we get to this question about where is God when it hurts, the answer is, like my pastor said, God is in the same place where he was when his son died. God sent his son into the world, not to condemn the world, but to save the world. Jesus says that God so loves the world that he gave his only son. The message of the New Testament is a message that says God entered our world. God suffered our pain. He dealt with all of the suffering and the death of the cross because he loves you. because he was so moved and he so cares about you. He is so intimately and intricately concerned about the sufferings and the agonies of your life that even when he got to the funeral for his friend Lazarus, when he saw Mary and Martha upset, he got upset and he cried. John 11:35, the shortest verse in the English Bible. Jesus wept. And then he doubled over in grief. Why? He was about to raise the man to new life. Because God cares. He is moved to compassion. He's not some impassible, uncaring God. And his vision of the future, the vision of the new Jerusalem and the new creation at the end of the book of Revelation. I read this at almost every funeral that I do, especially when I stand by the graveside. As I said that his vision of the future is that one day there will be no more death and no more crying and no more pain. For the old order of things has passed away and all things are being made new. That God is going to eradicate suffering and pain and death. That what is experienced now will not always be. And that God, because he was willing to get into the hot seat for us, and our hot seat, meaning he died for our sin and our suffering, he is able to remove from us eternal suffering and eternal death in what we know of in the Bible as a place called hell. Then God is able to finally and completely resolve the issue of suffering for us. Now, what we find out is that at the end of the book of Job, the question of where is God when it hurts, or where are you, God, is not really the primary question the book's trying to answer. It's trying to answer the question of how do we think about God when we suffer. But when I ask, where are you, God, when you suffer, the answer should be, God's not far away. God is near. God is caring. God is concerned. And what I should think about God when I'm going through something difficult and hard is that I should understand that about God, know the heart and the care of God, the love of God, and it should transform the way that I think and respond. Now, as we finish our time together and as we finish the book of Job together, I would be remiss if I didn't share with you something that I've known for a long, long time. And that is, when you study the whole of the Bible and not just the book of Job, we discover that there are a lot of reasons for human suffering in our world. The book of Job deals with only a couple reasons, but there are tons more. This isn't even an exhaustive list, but I want to just share with you 10 purposes of suffering in all of our lives. You know, the Bible starts by telling us of one of the first purposes of suffering. Remember, after Adam and Eve sinned, God cursed the earth and the serpent, and he punished them, and he kicked Adam and Eve out of the Garden of Eden. One of the first causes of suffering is punishment. Their children, Adam and Eve's first children, Cain and Abel, are making an offering. And of course, Abel brings a blood offering, a sacrifice. And this is another cause of suffering, is sacrifices in their various forms and fashions. But then also, as we see other people physically suffering in our lives, throughout all of Scripture and in our lives today, we feel suffering emotionally. If I see even a dog on television, you know, in a TV commercial who's suffering, I'm feeling hurt. I run over a squirrel accidentally on the road that chases out in front of me. I can feel it in my gut. I'm thinking, that is awful. I don't want to do that. So we experience suffering for different reasons, different purposes. And then, of course, there are divine trials of suffering. You know, God will sometimes allow people to go through trials. Now, Job is not on trial in the book of Job. God is on trial in the book of Job. But there are people in Scripture who do go through suffering trials. In 1 Peter, it talks about, 1 Peter chapter 1, I'm going to start a Bible study on that soon, so I'm thinking about it. It talks about suffering as like going through a refiner's fire that proves the genuineness of our character. Like gold is refined in a fire and it removes the impurities, sometimes God allows us to go through suffering because it's part of a divine trial of our lives. And there are people in the Bible who go through these divine trials. But there are lots of other reasons. I don't have time today to go through all of them, but I'll just mention a few more to you. One is that we know from Scripture that suffering often has the purpose of God trying to teach us a lesson. In the Proverbs, it says, "My son, do not despise the Lord's discipline. Do not resent his rebuke, because the Lord disciplines those he loves as a father, the son he delights in." The author of Hebrews talks about how God disciplines those he loves. A parent may punish a child to teach him a lesson. I don't want you to run in the street, so I'm going to teach you something. It's not to do that. A police officer pulls somebody over, gives them a ticket for not having a seatbelt on. Why? Well, to teach you to be safe so that you get in a car accident, you'll survive. So sometimes suffering is just about learning a lesson. Sometimes suffering is actually a revelatory event, a revelation experience. In Matthew 5:45, Jesus says that God causes the sun to rise on the unjust and the just, the evil and the good, and he sends rain on the righteous and the unrighteous. What does that mean? It means that every morning we wake up, the sun rises. The sun doesn't just shine on bad people or good people. The sun shines on everybody. When it rains on good people's houses and bad people's houses. Now, the same rain that can bring one thing can bring something else. It can bring something good. It can bring something bad. But God causes these things to happen in a way, and there's a kind of almost randomness to it for some of us in our lives as we experience it. And then here's an eighth one. God sometimes allows suffering in our world for the purpose that is that could be perceived of as being sinister. Think about Jesus dying on the cross. Okay, there's two sides to the story. One side of the story is God loves you. God did this for you. What's the other side of the story? The other side of the story is Jesus was betrayed by Judas. He was handed over by the Jewish leaders to the Romans, and he was crucified on a Roman cross. All of that was intent on hurting, harming. It was all sinister. The devil was literally at work in the crucifixion of Jesus so that he would say, my God, why have you forsaken me from the cross? Which leads us to the ninth reason for suffering, which is that sometimes suffering to us and for us feels mysterious. When David wrote, "My God, why have you forsaken me?" he didn't have an answer to that question. And Job doesn't have an answer to that question. Jesus, of course, does have an answer to that question. He knows that it's part of the purpose and the plan and the will of God. God's trying to bring about God's desired results through the experience. But these are all reasons for suffering. And then the final one is, I don't know if you know the word eschatological. Eschatos means the end times. That one day God is going to bring even more suffering into our world as a part of his perfect plan to remove the vestiges of sin. There's going to be divine justice, or we would put it like this: there will be hell to pay. And so there is another form of punishment, suffering, that has an eternal characteristic to us. And that's part of what makes the good news is the bad news. That is another purpose for suffering, is actually that there is going to be a permanent divine situation of punishment or hell to pay. Now, these are all different reasons for suffering. And I want to, just as we finish this time together, I want to give you a few things to think about. I don't know if you know the name Henry Nouwen. I've got on my shelf over here a stack of his books. Henry Nouwen was a man who had lived quite a life, and then God called him to work with people who were really challenging for anyone to work with, and that were dealing with a lot of suffering. And out of his experience, he would write some amazing works. Once he said, "Because we have lost perspective, we fail to see that unless one is willing to accept suffering properly, he or she is really refusing to continue in the quest for maturity. To refuse suffering is to refuse personal growth." What Henry Nouwen is saying here in this passage is a lot of times when we experience suffering in our life and we go, "Where is God when it hurts?" We don't want to suffer. We want the pain to stop. And if we're not smart to know that the difference between, suffering that we shouldn't have to deal with and suffering that we inevitably do have to deal with, we can make the mistake that we don't want to have any suffering at all. And that is actually going to prevent us from growing. Lately I've been getting up every morning and I've been running. And every morning I have to go through this thing inside my head, like, do I want to get out there and run? It's hot or it's hard. And then I keep reminding myself that old saying, no pain, no gain. Well, I think it's true, isn't it? I mean, sometimes suffering in life is very, very important. A student in school reading and studying and learning so they can do good in life, a soldier in the military, a person doing their job. There are so many things that are hard and grueling, and there's an element of suffering involved in them. But if we don't allow for suffering in our life, then we are actually going to eliminate the potential for growth. So one of the problems of the book of Job is some people go, oh, when it comes to suffering, I don't want to suffer. All suffering's bad. I don't like the God I read about in the book of Job. Well, the truth is that suffering in life that has purpose can be incredibly helpful. In fact, it's essential to growth. The problem is what Job dealt with in the book of Job is that he didn't know why he was suffering. He couldn't point to, oh, I'm running in order to get better. No, he lost his children. He lost his wealth. He lost his health. Why? What's going on? What did I do? Well, I didn't do anything. God's not a judging God. That's not what's happening here. He's not in the judgment seat. God's not in the empty seat. He's not a not caring God. He's also not a Santa who's just doling out things if I'm good and not if I'm bad. I'm not on the naughty list, in other words. But why? It's a mystery. G.K. Chesterton, such a famous Christian writer from years ago, once made this comment. He said that the riddles of God are more satisfying than the solutions of man. And what he's trying to say here, I think, is really profound. If you know the word profound, it means profound, something that's really beyond our ability to fully grasp. The riddles of God are more satisfying than the solutions of man. The truth is that suffering sometimes is a mystery to us. We don't have it. We don't have the information. We don't know why. But if we can learn to trust God, even when life doesn't make sense to us, if we can learn not to always expect justice, that things are going to be fair, but trust that God is wise, that God is on His throne, that God does care, that God is there, what can begin to happen is that we can begin to find ourselves drawing closer to God in and through our suffering and through our experience. Now, I want you just to think about one other thing as we kind of finish this time together. And this is a poem called Walked a Mile with Suffering. And a few times in my ministry as a pastor, I've read this at funerals. I remember a really dear woman in the church who'd had a long battle with cancer. And I remember reading this at the funeral, and I remember just, weeping through the experience. Because everybody was trying to understand why God didn't heal and why God didn't come through with a miracle. And it didn't make any sense to us. And sometimes we're so focused on why didn't God do this and why is this happening and all of that we forget to see the opportunity that we have in the midst of what we're going through to remember that God is actually doing something. And it may be months, maybe years, decades, or maybe at the end of our life or after our life before we really begin to understand what we learned through the process of our suffering. I walked a mile with laughter. The poem starts. She chatted all the way. But I was none the wiser for all she had to say. I walked a mile with sorrow, and not a word said she. But oh, the things I learned when sorrow walked with me. Now, this poem is really profound because it's kind of what we've been talking about this whole time. I walked a mile with laughter, meaning, when life is good and times are good and we laugh and we have a good time, we chat and, but I'm none the wiser. I walked a mile with sorrow. Not a word said she, but oh, the things I learned when sorrow walked with me. I learned through my suffering. I've learned through my agony. I've learned through what I've experienced. In the New Testament, it says that Jesus learned obedience through what He suffered. As hard as it is to imagine, purposeful suffering can become one of the greatest teachers in our life. And if we can begin to draw near to God and closer to God and listen to God and let Him speak to us through what we're going through, we can grow potentially spiritually in our lives through our experience. Now I want to finish with a quote from David Klein's. Over here on my shelf, I've got a bunch of commentaries on the book of Job. And the largest commentary I know of is a 3-volume commentary. I think the total length of it is 1,500 pages. It's about 500 pages for each of the volumes on the book of Job. And it's called the Word Biblical Commentary. David Kleins wrote it, did this incredible work on the book of Job. But he makes this comment that I think is worth really considering, because one of the things that the book of Job makes us really think about is what to say and respond to God when we don't know what to say and respond to God, and we're feeling the intensity of our emotions and our feelings. So he says this: by all means, let Job the patient be your model, so long as it's possible for you. Now, if you were paying attention in the series, you know that the idea of Job the patient is not really a good translation of the passage in the book of James. It actually means Job the long sufferer. But what he's sort of saying is there are a lot of people that read the book of Job and they draw comfort from Job kind of enduring hardships. He says, but there's another lesson from the book. He says, but when the equanimity fails, let the grief and the anger of Job, the impatient, be directed toward God. For only an encounter with Him will the tension of suffering be resolved. What the book of Job, what Kleins is saying here is so important. And it's so much a part of the book that one of the things that we see in the book of Job that Job does so right is when he is so angry and he's so frustrated and he's hurt and he's trying to understand, he directs all of that toward God. And he wants God to come near, and he wants to have this conversation, and he wants to have an encounter with God and an explanation from God. But he directs all of that emotion toward God. And then when God finally shows up, and this is what Klein says here, only an encounter with God will the tension of suffering be resolved. It's a reminder that when God finally comes near to us in our pain, that even though we don't have all the answers to it, His very presence in that moment, His very presence makes all of that sort of just disappear in the light of His presence. All of the questions, all of the frustrations, all of the uncertainty. We're just enraptured by His presence, by His power, by His glory, by His warmth, by His love. In other words, the book of Job was written to help us change the way we think about God when we suffer, to show us that we should draw near to Him and trust Him. We should not be pushed further away from God or farther away from God because of our suffering, but we should be brought nearer to God in and through the experiences that we have in our life. I hope the things that we've talked about in this series have been helpful to you. I hope that if you go through a period of time in your life where you're dealing with some kind of suffering, I pray that you can reflect back on some of these conversations, or maybe you can point some other people to understand how they can deal with suffering in their life, because sooner or later we're all going to face one of these moments. Maybe not as intense as Job's, but we're going to face a moment where we're going to sense that God has left the building, and it's going to feel like He doesn't care and He isn't there, or worse, that He's a mean judge kind of pointing His finger at us, and we're going to be tempted to just get into that bartering relationship with Him and just say, oh, He's like the mafia, we're going to pay Him off so that good stuff happens to us. Don't do that. God is in your hot seat. God knows your pain. God knows your heartache. God knows what you're going through. He knows and He cares and He loves you so much that He sent His Son Jesus to die for you. And He's got a great plan, not only to deal with the sin that happened after creation, but through the salvation of Jesus to a new creation, to bring about a world where there's no longer any suffering or pain or death or dying. God's got all of this in His big master plan, and all we got to do is trust Him.